Welcome to the Camera Shake Podcast, episode 116, the podcast where we talk about photography, videography, and anything that's got anything to do with any of that. Now, we're back. We're one day late. Sorry about that. But we're reunited.
We are. In a different location.
In a different location, not in the studio.
It's a very hot day, so we figured we'd just go for a drive and have a chat.
Another hot day. Anyway,
let's
go.
All right, here we go. Let's see. I don't even know where we're going, actually. Where should we go?
If you watch the background, you can get a tour
Oh, yeah,
of
true.
Eden,
True.
Windsor.
That is very true. All right.
This
Let's
is
be all you for a second. Because,
this is the second time that we've done this sort of driving episode. The first time we were en route to a job in London. Today it's just going to be a joyride.
I'd forgotten all about that. Haven't we done it? Oh, plus when we went to see Dave, obviously.
Oh yeah, correct.
That wasn't quite the same though, was it?
Not quite. That was just some behind the scenes
True.
sort of thing.
Very true. And we actually have no idea whether you can hear us or not.
We're still testing out the Rode, what are they called? Rode Go 2. Wireless Go 2.
Wireless go-to.
Ah.
And I had a few issues with it last time, so we're going to give it another go. Totally different setting. And see if we get any different results.
Yeah, see if you can hear our voices over the wind noise.
You will.
And the car.
I'll cut all that out.
No.
Well, you know what? Maybe I'll do a quick. This is without. This is with and without.
Exactly.
Which way should we go? We'll go left.
So we're back in the UK, or I'm back in the UK, but not for very long because I'm actually flying out again next Wednesday.
Oh, are you?
Yeah. Then back out for another week.
You really don't want to be here, do you?
Surprise? No, so I've been away for 2 weeks. Now I'm back for about 10 days and then out again on Wednesday. So the next episode, actually, in fact, the next episode we'll have to plan. We'll shoot here, and then the one after that we'll shoot remotely. So yeah, so follow us for that. But for today, well, first of all, let's just talk about some news. Any particular news?
Good question. What news is there? Well, it's a bit geeky, and I don't know if anyone's going to be interested, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because it's really important for audio, and it's just what I mentioned. So I've got a new plugin that I'm using on audio right now, which is run by AI, and it gets rid of all, for the majority of cases, all background sounds. So hopefully it's going to be doing a good job right now, and you won't hear anything other than our voices.
So here we are testing that right now.
Yeah. I've only used it a couple of times so far. It's quite CPU heavy. So you don't want to run more than a couple of these in a session. But initial thoughts are it's great. So it's by Waves, and it's called Clarity.
So this is one of the major problems, I think, when it comes to audio, especially for video. Because typically when you record audio for video, and you're not in a controlled studio environment, you pretty much always have to deal with background noise when you're on location.
That's right, yeah.
And I mean, you couldn't have any more background noise than this right now.
Well, this is true. This is very, very true.
So this will really test this plugin to its limit.
Yeah, exactly. I'm also not sure whether we're blowing out right now or not. I've got 4 stops of ND going on?
Well, luckily, if you are listening to this on audio, then you won't have that issue, but well, you might have to deal with not being able to hear us at all.
You know what? It's going to be what it's going to be. Exactly. I think it's going to be fine.
Exactly. It's a test.
Yeah.
We're known for testing things on this.
We are.
On this podcast.
And hopefully they generally work out, but we'll see.
So, interesting thing you mentioned about taxing the CPU, because I had some taxing CPU issues of my own the other day. Yeah. So, I had to, my daughter went and shot some video and came back. I looked at the shots. They looked okay, but they were on the dark side.
Okay.
So the exposure she didn't really quite nail the exposure on the day. So, I had to kind of bring the exposure up a little bit, which of course introduced noise because I have no idea what ISO she shot it on. That was another thing. But it ended up being really quite noisy.
Okay.
So I ran Neat denoiser.
You did what?
You know the Neat denoiser?
Oh, yeah,
plugin?
yeah.
Which worked like a treat.
Good, is it? Not used to it.
It was really amazing. However, boy did it bog
Yeah.
down my CPU. Oh my
Yeah,
god!
you got a decent machine.
Yeah, I mean it was noticeable. You know, the whole video is probably about 20 minutes long or something like that, or maybe half an hour long actually. And it took a good. Once I'd done everything else, I ran the denoiser at the very end.
Yep.
And it probably took about 5 hours. Yeah.
How many images are we talking?
Well, no, this is video. Like
30, video,
30
right?
minutes,
Yes, of course.
30
Right.
minutes of video.
Good. 30 minutes, and it took 5 hours.
It was just slogging away. It was very noisy footage, though.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
That reminded me of the good old days of CS3, CS2,
Yeah.
CS3, something like that.
So Neat is it's heavy, and there are
Very
particular ways to set it up. Actually, processes to go through to get the maximum benefit for hopefully as little, artifacts, I guess, and things like that. But I stopped using it once I moved to Resolve.
Right.
Because Resolve is just as good.
Okay.
Maybe not in every scenario, and it's got the edge in certain circumstances, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But you know, it does add time, obviously, to export, but not a huge amount.
I mean,
It's very efficient.
yeah, Neat really worked well. I mean, I have to say, it did really get rid of the noise. I mean, it did do a great job.
Yeah.
And it didn't blur it out at all. You know, it still looks sharp. Like the image is good. It's really enhanced the whole thing. So that was, it worked really well. But man, I had to wait for it
What was it filmed on?
on the D750.
750.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what actually happened was is that she ramped up the ISO too high.
Yeah.
And then it didn't really work with the aperture to get a good exposure.
Yeah.
So what actually, the end result was really just that it was slightly too dark and still too noisy.
Yeah. If I remember rightly, once you start hitting sort of 800 or so, the noise starts to creep in quite a bit on that. Still perfectly usable, mind you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And even probably up to 1600, maybe not, but yeah. Okay, well, that's cool. Show me about the export time.
Yeah. So,
Have you got a before and after little clip that we can potentially add in here if we've got time?
I would probably have to render that out again. For
Excellent, do it. Yeah, do that.
for 4
Do
hours. But yeah, I mean, again, it worked well. It's the first time I've used it. Well, the first time I've used it properly, actually, and
or even a still with it turned
oh yeah, I can get
of the finished article and maybe the same frame, give or take, with it turned off on your machine. That'd be good.
So yeah, so that was quite eventful.
Just stop in there, is he?
So the other thing, well, actually, I tell you what, the other thing that I did whilst I was in Germany was a little bit of black and white sort of street photography.
Okay.
Not necessarily street photography, I would say, but just I was just enjoying some of the black and white presets I set up on my Fuji because that's all I took.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what I did do was I basically recorded last week's episode entirely on the Fuji, which worked extraordinarily well. So surprisingly, when you get to grade the actual footage, the actual video, it's super easy to grade. Really no problem at all.
Yeah, yeah. Good.
Yeah. So for what it was, it looked okay. One of the downsides is that the Fuji only has like a 14-minute recording.
That's a pain.
But
It's a real pain.
the entire episode was relatively short, so it was
Is
really
it? Do you know if it's 8-bit or 10-bit footage that records?
zero idea. Yeah. It doesn't record in 4K, so it was 1080, strictly.
Yeah.
But actually, the way it looked, it actually looked good.
And that's it. I mean, this is it with these type of things. It depends what you're doing with it. If you want something that just is good straight out of camera, that's easy enough to achieve, right? It's only when you start wanting to do a lot more with it is when probably something like the Fuji will start to break down.
Absolutely.
But that's not necessarily what you're doing, is it?
So but the thing there is I think is that, you ultimately need the right tool for the job. And I thought about something that we could do in maybe next week's episode. And that is, we could have a look at the best kind of entry-level cameras for video.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd originally planned to do that for today's episode, but seeing that we're in the car, changed plans a little bit.
There is that, yeah.
But, so I thought it'd be a really good idea just to kind of get an overview of the best entry-level cameras specifically for video.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling that there's a pretty good overlap
I think there's a lot out there,
between
actually.
photo and video in that
yeah.
respect. There's been a whole bunch of really cool entry-level cameras that have come out over the last 18 months or something that that would really absolutely do the trick.
Silence.
I have no idea where we are.
You don't need to know.
Right.
It'll just be some back end of nowhere. There'll be a white van waiting to take you away.
Join us on this ride through the English countryside. Anyway, so for today, as we're accelerating and nearly hitting the speed of sound,
The speed of sound.
I thought we'll talk about the top 10 beginner mistakes in photography. We've all made them,
Still make them.
and we're still making them. But I think we all have our sort of our own personal top 10 of beginner mistakes.
Absolutely.
Some of them are maybe more beginner than others.
Go on then. What we got?
All right, so
Is this in any particular order?
It's in no particular order, actually.
Fair enough.
No, I think though. But for me, the number one beginner
Before
mistake.
you do say number one, can you just let everyone know when you wrote these down?
Literally, they came to me on the way from my house to your house.
So how did you write all that information down?
That would have been not necessarily particularly legal.
Oh. There's no evidence of that, though.
Well, I can multitask.
Yeah,
Of course.
yeah. I can do nothing with either
Well,
hand.
the disadvantage is I can barely read my handwriting. It's worse than it normally is.
Brilliant.
Anyway, so I think my number one beginner mistake is it's really focusing too much on gear
Yeah.
in the very beginning. I think that's one of the things that I find, speaking to a lot of people who are just getting into photography, they're really focused way too much on gear. And I think I'm probably guilty of the same thing.
Absolutely.
I think originally
I think we all are. Definitely.
But I think the thing to realize is that, if you can't use an entry-level camera and you can't get any good images out of an entry-level camera, then using a more expensive camera isn't really going to make any difference to that.
No.
So
it will, as we've said many times, it will give you added convenience and some, higher resolution, things like that. Sure. But that doesn't detract from it being that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a better photo.
no, and focusing on gear isn't going to make you a better photographer. I mean, it's fun. We all know that, right? But it's not really going to make you a better photographer. Per se. It's
No, it's the opposite, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're better off, spending more time learning and practicing, with your, Canon Rebel entry-level camera, whatever it is that you may have.
Yeah.
And get better that way, because ultimately, do you have to keep doing the thing, to get better at it?
Absolutely.
So yeah, focus on gear. It's not necessarily a waste of time, but in terms of, if you really want to progress as a photographer, I think, you could spend your time more wisely.
And I guess it's worth mentioning, when the right time to change gear is.
For sure. I mean, when the equipment that you're using isn't capable of achieving the results that you want to achieve, then you're probably in the right spot to look at an upgrade.
Certainly worth considering at that point.
Yeah. I mean, a good example, gear. When we talk about gear, of course we talk about camera bodies and lenses and all the rest of it, for example. But, okay, so let's stick with lenses for a second. Let's say, for instance, you get a camera, you're really into landscape photography, you go out there, you've got a lens that will do the trick, for landscape, a kit lens or something like that, and then you might at some point want to get into portrait photography. And when it comes to portrait photography, you really need to make sure that you're using the right focal length. That's not necessarily the same as it would be for landscape photography.
Mm-hmm.
We'll come back to that actually a little bit later as well, more specifically. But that's really a good opportunity to think about, well, maybe I can, buy some extra gear, maybe an extra lens. Doesn't have to be expensive because, let's face it, you don't have to get a 50 mil or an 85 millimeter, like 1.2 or 1.4 lens. You could perfectly start off with a 1.8, which is a much cheaper option, and it will totally do the trick. Because the reality is, in portraiture, you very rarely ever actually shoot it.
I don't particularly like the look any lower than 2.8 all that much. It's very particular.
Exactly. Plus, once you get into, to using additional lighting, like a speed light, for example, or multiple speed lights, some modifiers, then really, you're most likely going to be shooting at apertures more like 5.6, 7.1, so something, around that area. So you don't necessarily need to really worry about whether, your lens goes up to 1.4 or 1.8, really at that point. You can save yourself a lot of money by buying a slightly cheaper, prime lens.
Absolutely. I think the first lens I ever owned was the plastic Nifty 50.
Yeah, same. Same. I mean, apart from the kid lens that came with my first camera body, I think.
Yeah, I didn't have a kit lens of mine.
It was like I think it was a Sigma. I can't remember. It's a zoom lens, typical.
But if you got a kit lens that, is a 24 to 70 or something like that,
it's usually like an 18 to 55. It's like
just
something like that.
Use it. Understand what that each particular focal length looks like.
Yeah.
At least the extreme ends of it, and really understand what that's doing in your image in different situations, whether you're shooting a person or or a landscape. What is it actually doing to the image at that focal length? And you'll learn what you like, what looks good, what doesn't work at all, and eventually you can go out when that lens no longer gives you the quality that you want, or isn't fast enough, and you can go and get a 50 or an 80 or whatever it might be. Right.
But the other argument, of course, is rather than getting another lens, you might be better off actually just getting a cheap speed light.
Yeah.
And learn, off-camera flash, for example. That's a really good thing to do, especially at the beginning. I think light is such an important factor that you want to be able to control and handle at the beginning, that it's, I always think it pays off more in the end. If you focus more on lighting, whether it's using available light and just getting that right, or using off-camera flash, for example, and getting to grips with that, you can you can really add to your gear list relatively cheaply, by buying a cheap third-party speed light.
The young new ones, I've got 4 of them, I believe, 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah, young new is
and they're they're like the 120 quid versions, like which are basically their upper end.
Yeah.
You don't need them. You can get them for 70 quid.
Exactly.
Or you can get them second hand for
Absolutely.
40 or 50 probably.
Yeah, that's it. You can get cheap modifiers like a pop-up softbox, for example, or an umbrella, and a cheap light stand. That's it. The whole thing could probably set you back you could probably get the whole thing for like 70 quid.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
So that's, that's a much more useful way of spending your time.
Definitely.
I guess, especially in the beginning. Oh, by the way, as we're like talking about our top 10, beginner mistakes, if you have any, particular mistakes that you have grappled with, get in touch, let us know, send us a message, leave a comment. It'd be really interesting to hear. Maybe we're missing out some, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. But it'd be really interesting to hear your opinion. Anyway, so focus on gear number 1. Now, my seconds, my second mistake in the top 10 of beginner mistakes is really not knowing the camera shooting modes.
Not knowing the camera
shooting modes.
Yeah.
So it's only natural that as a beginner, you're probably going to start out in auto, and eventually you're going to make that transition to completely manual, which is fine. But understanding all the shooting modes, whether it's aperture priority or shutter speed priority, it's really super important, because it can make your life a lot easier in any given shooting situation.
Yep.
And understanding the exposure triangle is absolute key for any beginner.
Absolutely.
So, practicing that is super important, because understanding it in theory is one thing, but actually seeing the effects of shutter speed and ISO and aperture in reality, especially how it relates to your lens and your camera, that's really super, super, super important.
Absolutely.
So it's, in my view, it's absolutely critical to really get to grips with those.
That's how I learn what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO actually really do. That's how I very first learned, was by using those modes. I would put it in auto ISO. I'd put it in aperture priority. So literally the only thing I can affect is the aperture. Everything else will take care of the general exposure, because it's automatic then, except for the aperture. So I can really see what aperture does to my image.
Yeah.
And then exactly the same settings, but into shutter priority, and then moved from that into, effectively into manual at that point. And then started playing around with ISO a bit more, but that's easier to get to grips with ISO.
Yeah, I kind of did the opposite, actually. I sort of went straight into manual. I literally took the camera out of the box and went, auto, forget about that. Let's go all manual. I had zero idea. And
you're shamed into going into manual.
Well, and so it took quite some time for me to get to grips with everything, but what it did do was, it really gave me really good fundamental understanding of the exposure triangle. And the only reason I started, getting into some of the semi-automatic modes, like aperture priority or shutter speed priority, was just simply because I started shooting concerts, and there were certain situations where I kept missing shots because I kept changing the settings all the time, and I realized it just took too long to change my settings and to react to changing lighting conditions and everything else. So, I found that using some of the semi-automatic modes actually made my life easier. And the other thing was, of course, shooting events. That's another thing where aperture priority can come in really, really handy.
Yep.
Because it just allows you to focus on what you're shooting rather than having to constantly changing your settings.
Absolutely. Yeah. And aperture priority is, when I'm not in manual, is the one I use most. Occasionally I'll go into shutter if I do need to control the shutter effectively. And what that means is generally something that's moving at a decent pace, right? And that's pretty much it.
The thing in event photography is that you're there to capture moments.
Yeah.
And if you keep puffing around with your camera settings all the time, you end up missing moments. And that means you're sort of missing the point in what you're doing there in the first place.
Yeah.
So letting the camera take control over some of your settings can actually make your life a lot easier because you know you're getting the shot. And as a consequence, you know, you end up capturing the moments, you end up having better shots to deliver, and you know, it only has a positive impact on the work that you create. And so therefore, you know, hopefully your clients like your work more and you get more work as an end result. Well, there you go.
That's it.
You know, aperture priority, the moneymaker.
What's next?
Shooting JPEG.
Okay.
So shooting JPEG,
This is controversial, isn't
it's
it?
very controversial. Well, is it controversial? It probably isn't. It
Depends what you're about to say.
probably isn't. Right. So shooting JPEG can have advantages and it can have major disadvantages.
Yeah.
Obviously, one of the advantages of shooting JPEG is that you can...
What's the Rozzers?
it's the brothers.
It's the Rozzers.
It's the brothers. Yeah, one of the advantages of shooting JPEG is, of course, that JPEG files in themselves are much smaller. They don't take up as much space on your memory card.
Yeah, true.
But the reality is, I mean, SD cards are relatively inexpensive nowadays. So
Yeah.
it's really not so much of a problem, you know. The big disadvantage is that everything is literally baked into the file. So you don't really get as much flexibility in post when you're editing after the fact.
You're stuck with whichever color profile
You're stuck with
selected,
pretty
right?
much whatever you have, and you know, and if you're losing the definition in the shadows, or you know, your highlights get close to clipping, then there's not much you can do about that. And it's not entirely true. You can get some of it back, but you know, in no way are as flexible as you would be with raw files. The disadvantage with raw files, of course, is that you have to edit them. So there are situations where it might make sense to shoot JPEG and RAW, which is what I do on my Fuji, for example, all the time. And when I went to Germany, I made a point in shooting JPEGs. I mean, I did shoot RAW as well, just in case there's like an exceptional shot or whatever. But everything really that I shot on the Fuji was, you know, I just took the JPEGs, brought them over onto my phone, you know, put them into Lightroom Mobile and give them a quick once over, and that's it.
And there'll be certain profiles on different cameras which it actually does really, really well. And I think one of your black and white ones on the, which is what you said you did a lot of shooting in while you were abroad.
Yeah, correct.
Your black and white profile on the Fuji is fantastic. It looks great.
I also have a really cool color profile. So I really only use those two profiles to shoot.
Is that a profile that came with it, or one that you created yourself?
That's what I created, yeah. But here's the thing. I really chickened out on this, and this is one thing I'm going to change next week. Right? I went into it thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I spent 2 weeks only shooting black and white, right? And it sort of takes a certain discipline to do that.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of situations where you think, oh, well, this is a really great sky, or the lighting is beautiful, and you switch to a color profile, right? And that's exactly what I did. And in the end, I looked at the photos that I shot whilst I was in Germany. I kind of thought, you know what? The next time I go, I'm going to be a lot more disciplined. And so when I go over next week, it's literally going to be a week of black and white.
Yep.
And I don't care. So that's the one thing. Yeah, where I felt like chicken out a little bit on that. I got some cool shots, but actually, I think I was sort of distracted by thinking whether I would shoot something in color or in black and white, a particular scene. So we had a few conversations with some pro photographers, actually, on this podcast, Scott Johnson, notably, who is really into shooting JPEGs.
Yeah.
And makes a really good point. And if you want to listen to that,
and he's a bit of all right, isn't he?
Yes, well. If you want to
photographer, I mean.
Exactly. So if you want to watch that episode, I'll put the link up here somewhere. But yeah, so what's beginner mistake number 4?
Don't know, you tell me.
Bad composition.
Yeah? Yeah.
You know, composition is one of these things. I think again, it's one thing that really comes with practice, and by actually looking at loads of photographs.
Yeah.
You're not really going to get around actually looking at loads of photography if you want to get better at photography. I mean, in the same way that you're going to have to listen to a lot of music if you want to get better as a musician.
Precisely.
So you can't really get around that.
Yeah.
You know, in composition, or where you place something in a photograph, is what makes or breaks a photo. And too often, you know, I see the same beginner mistakes made again and again. You know, one thing would be, for instance, to center the subject right in the center of the frame.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the thing that we would naturally do at the beginning. You know, you pick up the camera, you point it at something, you make sure the thing is in the middle, your subject, and, you know, you take a shot and that's it.
And don't get me wrong, there are circumstances where actually that's the right thing to do.
Sure.
Totally depends on what you're doing, particular portraits, whatever it might be. There are circumstances where actually that looks great.
But learning something like the rule of thirds, for example, can get you a long way of improving your photography, you know, right off the bat.
That's it.
And if you are watching this on YouTube, keep an eye.
Be able to see.
Keep an eye on the background. If you were just going past Windsor Castle, where in actual fact the Queen should reside.
I don't know if she's in right now or not.
How can you tell?
She might pop to the shops.
Oh.
I think she popped to McDonald's.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what have you eaten?
Well, as luck will have it, no.
Well, maybe we can hit a drive-through.
Well, there you go. I've had literally kilos and kilos of sausages, but I haven't had a McDonald's
That's what she said.
in like 3 weeks.
I don't know where I'm going, by the way.
Now, I mean, the other thing, you know, other than just centering the subject, the other thing that gets me all the time is basically shooting from eye level. This is such a beginner's mistake. You just basically grab the camera, you bring it up to your eye, you know, you look through the viewfinder, or
It's so natural, isn't it?
it's such a natural thing to do. It's such an easy trap to fall into, rather than trying to change the angle, you know, getting down on the ground,
Do something interesting with it.
finding a higher vantage point, you know, something like that, just to create some, you know, some kind of meaning in a photograph. You know, one good example, was one of the shots I took just whilst I was away, was a shot of my youngest daughter roller skating. And she, you know, she practiced her roller skating, she did really well, and I wanted to take a photo of her that really showed off her kind of, you know, her ability and her excellence, essentially. And so choosing a lower angle and making her, you know, appear imposing will really do that.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Did you go low for that one?
Exactly. I went low for that.
It feels imposing, like she's in charge.
Yeah, she's in charge.
Did you get the skates in?
Exactly. So
Brilliant.
So that's just you know, it's one little example of how you can vary your angle and actually put some meaning back into the photo. You know, had I shot her from a higher vantage point, it would have had more of a diminishing kind of effect. So you really want to think about, you know, where you place your camera with regards to the subject that you want to shoot and what you want to express in the photo. But it's a typical beginner's mistake, is really shooting from eye level.
Yeah. And again, and with all of these, that doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do in certain circumstances.
I think we're out of focus.
Are we? Oh well. Maybe we're out of focus. Never mind.
No, we're back in focus.
No, we're back in focus. Okay. It doesn't mean that you can't shoot from eye level. That's not what we're saying at all.
Yeah.
It's just understand how to do it and why you would want to do it from other kinds of angles.
Yeah.
And then you'll know, actually, this is an appropriate moment to do it from eye level.
Exactly, because there might very well be a reason for doing that. Reportage might be, you know, one of those examples.
Or you might just be really short, and for us, that's shooting from down the
shooting from the hip. You know, lack of depth in the photo is the other thing, you know, that you find a lot with beginner photographers. It's just not thinking about foreground, midground, and background.
Yeah.
You know, not being able to control the aperture to the point where you can, for instance, you know, blur out the background to create some bokeh, or you know, or placing objects in the foreground to create some depth. between the viewer and the subject. Those are all things that when you analyze photographs, you'll find that those devices are used a lot.
Yeah.
A very, very common sort of Instagram shot you see a lot is, when somebody shoots something through some branches or through some leaves or something like that, in the foreground, you immediately get that sense of depth. You get that sense that the main subject is further away from the viewer. So again, it's one of these things you might want to think about, and then you want to practice that. That has an immediate effect on your camera settings, potentially. So again, it's a really important thing to practice.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And then, of course, something, the next point is really something that we've mentioned early on, but it's bad lighting. Like, bad lighting is one of the telltale signs. I've never really seen, a professional photographer create an image that's lit badly.
What does lit badly mean?
As in, like, for instance, creating raccoon eyes, for instance, by, shooting in the middle of the day and having the sun, right on top of your subject, for example, or placing,
But again, that might be a very particular look that you're going for.
Yeah, if you're shooting portraits of raccoons.
But,
But for instance, placing your subject so that your subject's facing the sun, and all you get is like somebody just clenching an eyes shut. These are like very basic things, but thinking about how to light your subject, how the light falls onto your subject, learning the differences between hard light and soft light, learning off-camera flash, getting used to the effect that different modifiers have. All of that's really an important part of your learning as a new photographer. And focusing on lighting is something that's really important. For me, I did that very early on. Actually, I got my first off-camera flash like a week after I got my camera. Yeah, and I was experimenting with that first without any modifiers, and then I got a fold-up softbox, and I started experimenting with that, and it just went. Well, I went a little overboard with that, so now I have a whole room full of modifiers for all sorts of different occasions. But yeah,
probably along the lines of that is, don't use the built-in flash on your camera, please.
That's right.
There might be little moments where it's better than nothing. Chances are nothing is better.
But one moment where that could actually be of use is, for instance, if you want to use some fill flash when you're taking an image, we're taking a photo of somebody like outside, outdoors, the sun is behind your subject. You need to brighten that subject up a little bit.
Totally.
A little bit of fill flash.
I think we're getting beyond the realms of beginner at that point.
That's very true, but nevertheless, something to certainly think about.
Tommy Reynolds he doesn't use the inbuilt flash, he uses a ring flash around his lens to do a very similar job, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's slightly more advanced.
It is, absolutely, but the principle of doing that is there. And
Tommy, if you are listening,
better be.
Hopefully not in the car, then we'll have you back on the show very soon to talk about exactly that technique, because that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure lots of
maybe we can do it in person.
Ooh, very good point. Very good point.
Tommy.
There you go. All right, so what's next? Soft focus. Soft focus.
Again, we had a bit of that back there.
Well, exactly. See? Beginner's mistakes.
Well, that's because we're not paying attention and it's on auto.
And we're also driving at the same time. Yeah, soft focus is one of these things, there can be a number of reasons for why your focus might be soft, but it's definitely one of the main things you need to be able to control. And so again, this is a typical beginner's mistake. Soft focus can happen because of the shutter speed, for example. If shutter speed is too low, then things can, camera shake can come into play, especially when you're shooting handheld. If there's movement involved in the subject, for example, your shutter speed is too low, things are going to get fuzzy. Obviously not necessarily what you want. Sometimes it might just be what you want, but generally speaking, it probably won't be.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when you're shooting portraits, or just generally when you're shooting animals, pets or humans, it's a really good idea to focus on the eye. And there's a typical beginner's mistake, I think, is when you see images where, the focus is definitely not on the eye. Maybe it might be on, either the eyelash, it might even be on the nose, or maybe even the ear in the worst case scenario. Or what I've seen a lot with pet photography is that the focus is on the nose.
Tricky, that.
That's a really tricky thing, because especially with dogs, if you think about it,
it's the most prominent place.
Yeah, most dogs have a really long snout. The nose is considerably further away from, or closer to the camera in comparison to the eye. And now the question is, do we focus on the nose or do we focus on the eye? I think 9 times out of 10, although it's, for comical effect, focusing on the nose could be funny, but 9 times out of 10, you'd really want to make sure you focus on the eye, because that's really where all the life is.
Yeah.
And so, again, if you're a pet photographer and you disagree, get in touch. That's my impression anyway. And all the times I've taken photos of my dog.
Yeah.
That is the conclusion that I've come to. Anyway. And, one way of getting better results, as far as your focus is concerned, is to use something called back button focus.
Mm-hmm.
Back button focus is essentially when if you imagine when you're focusing on something, typically what you do is you press down the shutter button and you press it about halfway, the autofocus system starts focusing, then you press it all the way and it takes the shot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, back button focus it really just means that you're separating the focusing and the taking the shot bit, and you're basically applying that to 2 separate buttons. So the focusing bit will be a button on the back of the camera, some kind of function button that you can operate with your thumb, which basically then leaves your index finger to press the shutter button to take the shot, which also means that you can, you can set your focus to servo or continuous focus. And it basically means that as long as you keep your thumb on the button, it will carry on focusing, and you can then just use your index finger to take the shot. So by separating those 2 elements, you tend to get much better focusing results. So you tend to get more keepers in inverted commas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your yield in terms of in-focus images will be higher. So that's really something to bear in mind. And if you haven't experimented with that, try it. It might feel a little bit awkward for the first 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But before you know it, once you get used to it, you'll never go back.
That's absolutely. There are 100 videos out there on how to do it for
100%.
your particular camera. It's as simple as assigning that back button to it.
Yeah.
And unassigning the main shutter button.
So, number 7.
Is the camera moved, or is it just me? It doesn't look quite as straight as it did.
Yeah.
Is that loose? Oh well, if we're going a bit wonky, apologies. Not changing it now. Anyway, next.
Anyway, point number 7. The lack of action, movement, and emotion in a photo.
Yeah.
So, typically, example, if we stick with the dog example, this is an example that's used a lot. You point your camera at your pet, like your dog or your cat, as they're sleeping. You take a picture of your pet. That's what you get, sleeping dog. I mean, it's a picture of your dog, I guess, but it's not particularly interesting.
Yeah.
You really want to make sure that you capture some kind of movement or some kind of emotion in the image. It's really sort of that other dimension that makes a photograph work.
It's almost a difference between a photo and a snap to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a way of looking at it.
And the way that you get there is, well, first of all, by being patient. In a lot of situations, you just simply have to be patient to get a shot. Street photography is what I've learned, is one of these things where sometimes you just have to, just to hang around in the corner. You know where you want to shoot. You just have to wait for the right person to walk through that bit of light or whatever it might be. And you just have to be patient and wait for it to happen. So
were you sat there kind of, looking a bit like a pest? Were you in a long Mac?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Big fedora.
Big fedora.
And, just knowing when those impactful moments happen, because that's really what you want to photograph ultimately is, something with impact. Wedding photographers know that, because just photographing the couple isn't really going to do it. What you want is you want to capture those moments, the glimpses, the kisses, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Those are the things you want to capture. And what that means sometimes, very often actually, is that you have to get into the driving seat and actually direct your subject. So that's where it boils down to, confidence, experience, and really, ultimately just confidence to actually just say, right, I want you to do this or that, move your head this way, bring your chin up, blah, blah. Or you could be a little bit more, a little bit more, not necessarily vague, but you communicate with your subject in lots of different ways. You give them direct instructions, or you can basically say, just, hold each other as if you're, I don't know, carrying her over the door.
The threshold.
Threshold, that's it. I was going to say the doorknob.
The doorknob. Could be.
Maybe that's where I went wrong when I got married. I carried her over the doorknob.
I'm sure she'll appreciate you saying that. So the question is, do we pit stop now?
I think we should. Before we go to points 8, 9, 10, and 11.
That's all right. We can carry on for a minute. It's probably busy. Yep.
Right, anyway. Point number 8. It's using the wrong lens or focal length. We sort of hit on that a minute ago. It's really important to know which focal length to use. Especially, a good example is portraiture, for example. We talk about this all the time. Using the right focal length in portraiture makes all the difference between making your subject look comically distorted or making the proportions look, realistic. And, that being said, so to give you an example, like typically in portraiture, the 85 is my absolute favorite portrait lens.
It's so sorry, his camera's so on the piss. I'm actually going to try and straighten it up. You can carry on talking though.
Which in British English, by the way, means it's not straight.
How's that?
So looks better.
Better?
Yeah.
Bit high maybe? Oh well.
Maybe.
Anyway, carry on.
Anyway, so the 85 is my personal favorite.
Yep.
Generally, because it just works really well. But it doesn't mean to say that there aren't situations where you'd want to use different focal lengths. For example, 50mm, I like using that when I do more than just a headshot type of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that works really well for anything from a 3/4 shot to even a full length shot works really well with a 50. That's what I find anyway. It depends a little bit on the angle, but that's sort of a go-to kind of a thing. And then, of course, if you want to create a particular effect, like I do in the 3 heads in a row project, for example, where I want the subject to look slightly cartoonish and comically distorted, that's where I'd use a much wider focal length, so more on the 24mm, 24 to 30mm type end. And of course, if you're shooting architecture or or landscape, for example, you quite naturally want to use much wider lenses.
Yeah.
24s, 35mm works really well in street photography, for example. It gives you a really good, really almost cinematic kind of field of view. Landscape 24s, all the way to the very super wide end, 14mm, on a full frame camera, for example. And the same with architecture. These super wide lenses work really well for architecture. If that's the kind of look that you want to create. So just knowing which focal length, which lens to use for the purpose that you're using it for, is extremely important. We did, a couple of sort of architectural jobs not too long ago, like interior photography, for example. The right choice of lens and focal length is absolutely critical in this. Otherwise, you just won't get any usable results. Pit stop 1 complete.
Belly's filled.
Where were we? I've forgotten. Oh. Point number 9.
Down the road.
Bad posing.
Bad posing.
Bad posing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bad posing. It's one of these things, we mentioned it a minute ago, but really just knowing how to pose somebody, how to take charge, how to direct is it's really vitally important. It just gives you a much better result in the end.
What would you class as a bad pose?
Well, a bad pose is, for instance, let's just imagine you photograph a couple, and you just have them both standing next to each other, doing nothing,
Right.
facing the camera full front.
Yeah.
It's like a typical example of okay, there's nothing happening. There's no interaction between the characters in the in the photo. So you want, especially when you have a couple or or two people or a group in a photo, you want people to interact to some degree. That's really quite important.
Yeah.
And without it looking too staged.
And that's where some experience comes into play.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So getting people to relax in front of the camera, directing them in a way that doesn't make it feel put on or or staged is that's really quite important. Again, that just really comes with experience.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
I think you find if you're photographing younger people these days, they might actually be quite natural at it because of the Instagram age, let's say. What you do find is you end up with the same pose.
Oh wow! With the pout.
The pouts.
Oh man, I couldn't hold back the other day. I had to go to Costco and have my membership card renewed, and you had to take a picture of you right there and then for the card.
Okay, yeah.
And of course, I immediately went into posing mode.
Of course you did. Vogue.
Yeah, exactly. Pout. But then she goes, "What did you do for business?" Wait, couldn't you tell? Oh my god!
I'm a professional model.
Exactly. Oh man,
I could be a part-time model.
Mm.
If any of you out there listening who know Flight of the Conchords, that was a reference.
Yep. Okay, well, bad posing. Now, number 10 in the top 10 of beginner mistakes. The classic, the one that we've all made, over editing.
Easiest thing in the world to do.
Oh my god. I came across an old Lightroom catalog of mine that's years old. And there was back in the day when I split up my Lightroom catalogs by year.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of thought, just out of curiosity, I'll just have a look, I'll load it up and see what, what's in there. Because I completely forgot what kind of images were in there. And and they were really terrible. Like,
in what way? What kind of over editing?
Completely over.
About?
I mean, the standard is basically oversaturated,
right.
Way too much, way too much contrast.
Yeah.
Way too crunchy. Totally way over the top. And of course, what that does is it immediately breaks up the skin tones, and it just looks terrible. And then of course, for as far as retouching is concerned, we look at old retouched portraits or headshots or something like that. Again, the skin is way overcooked.
Like you're a Barbie doll.
Like you're a Barbie doll, yeah, exactly. So, it's but it's all part of learning. All of that's fine. It's all that's all part of learning, and you get better. As you do it. And that's
I think it helps to go back to, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And just have a little look. So I think it's good to know how far you've come.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's surprising.
Or you may go, you know what? I like that. I'm going to go and try that again.
So there are a few instances where I looked at some of the images and I went, actually, I quite like that. I don't edit like that anymore, but in actual fact, that's not bad at all.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, but 99% of that was really pretty terrible. But, at least progress is noticeable.
Yeah.
So
that's it.
In that respect, it's, it's good. And you will find that, obviously.
Yeah.
Because you gotta get used to not only the software and everything else, but you also have to get used to seeing things. Your eye has to train and get better.
Yeah.
That's really that's quite important. So
Excuse me.
Woo-hoo. Now, that was point number 10, but we do have a bonus point. Clearly.
I do hope clarity works really well, and it just sounds like you're shouting for no reason.
Exactly.
I don't think it will on that, but there you go.
Right. The bonus point. I mean, point number 11 in the top 10 of beginner mistakes clearly has to be stop watching bloody YouTube and start making photographs.
Wow.
You know,
And on that bombshell. No.
on that bombshell, no. It's one of these things. I think, you know, learning is impossible. It's important, not impossible. Learning is important, you know, and YouTube can be an amazing resource for that, obviously. But it's really easy to kind of get drawn into that and get bogged down into like watching one video after another. And unless you actually pick up the camera and start shooting stuff and putting it into practice.
What's the point in watching it if you're not going to put it into practice?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, by all means, check out some things, you know, on YouTube, but then pick up your camera and actually
go try it.
Go try it. You know, it's so important. You're not really going to get better by watching something on a screen. You know, you're taking that knowledge and putting it into action, turning it into skill, because that's an important thing to remember, is that knowledge does not equal skill.
Yes. Knowledge is knowledge.
Knowledge is knowledge, and skill can come out of knowledge, but it's a whole different ballgame. So, you know, so that's the bonus point. You know, number 11 is like, you know, stop spending too much of your time watching stuff on YouTube. You know, make sure you
Unless
get
it's
out there.
this, obviously.
Unless it's a Camera Check podcast. So, because, you know, if you are listening to the audio version of this podcast, make sure you head over to YouTube where you can see us in full Technicolor, and you can find out why this episode may be sounding a lot.
Well, that was a particularly good, unscripted segue to that. I like it.
Exactly. So, yeah, that being said, we have come to the end of episode 116 of the Camera Check podcast.
I was hoping it was going to happen when we pulled up at home.
Oh, well. But now we're just...
It's not going to happen. We're too far away.
Well, exactly. There you go. Anyway, so if you are listening to the audio version of this podcast, you make sure you head over to YouTube. Otherwise, make sure you visit us on Instagram, TikTok, and all the other good platforms. Send us a message. Do you have any extra points? Is there anything that we forgot? Anything that you want us to add? Anything that you want to add?
What was that?
Anything you can think of that we haven't mentioned in our top 10 of beginner mistakes. It'd be super awesome. Also, do remember that we will be at the photography show in September. We'll talk more about that next week. We'll give you an idea as to what's happening there. But if you haven't booked your tickets yet, make sure you book your tickets. It's the biggest photography show in Europe, as far as I'm aware. And we'll be there. So hopefully see you there. Anyway, that's episode 116. See you next week.
See you later.